Hello and welcome to this Iron Raft self-build tutorial. In this video I'm going to show you how to seal up the front central strip and the rear central strip. This is the final stage of building your own Packraft. To get to this point we've already sealed all the tubing to the floor, we've reinforced the tubing to the floor seal, we've seam sealed all the insides of the seams, and it really is just a case of sealing up the front and end of the Packraft and then we're done. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the front central seam, and this seam is done almost exactly the same as all the other seams. Just one main difference is instead of starting from the outside of the boat and working towards the inside of the boat, on this one you start from the inside, you attach your seam to the inside point and work round to the outside point. Attachment wise it's exactly the same. You're going to take your seam and it's going to be TPU side facing upwards in order to lay down on the TPU side of the tubing, and you're going to fold over approximately a 1 centimeter tab at the end, so the TPU side on the folded over bit is going to seal with the TPU side of the floor. So you've got your folded over section, and just like before you're going to centrally align it in between the two tube pieces, and that's centrally aligned so they overlap to approximately halfway of that, and also so it leaves you with your tab at the bottom of it to seal down. So you can lay your strip right out in front of you, and this first section isn't going to require the bowl to get the curvature, it's just quite straight, so you can align it all just on the flat surface here. It's going to look a bit like that, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some baking paper. I've folded it over several times so it's about 4 layers thick, and I'm going to put it under there just as a precautionary measure to make sure that I don't melt the TPU from the tubing to the TPU from the floor. So that's just going to work as a heat barrier. Alternatively, you could put a section of wood or something in there, but you just got to be really careful whatever you put in there not to melt the TPU from the tubing to whatever material you put in between. Okay, so I've now aligned this here. As you can see, it's overlapping about halfway on the seam, and these two are going to line up on the flat surface. So I'm just going to seal that in position like that. It's really important that these two don't overlap each other. If you haven't got the alignment absolutely perfect, then you could trim a tiny amount, a millimetre or whatever you need to make sure they butt up to each other and don't overlap each other, because when they overlap you're left with the potential for a tiny little leak. So as before, I'm just going to tack it in place, and once I'm happy that's held in place, I'm going to make sure it's got a reliable seal pushed up to the edge using the edge of my iron. And remember, we're leaving this section here undone for when we get round. We've plied the seam all the way around, and that's going to slot in that gap there. Okay, so I've now done approximately 15 centimeters or so, and that's been fine to seal on the flat. It hasn't needed curve. I'm now going to put the bowl in to use the curve to help seal this next section coming up now. Now this is going to be exactly the same as when we curved it over the bowl on the previous seams. You may just need to find the best position for the bowl in order to get it for the seams to align nicely. So just play around with that and position it however you find works best to get that seam lined up. Okay, so I'm now up to the front point of the boat. You would have noticed to get to this point, This aligned on the flat quite easily and that was no problem. But when you get to the point, the angle is quite sharp and you're going to have to do just a small section of the seam at a time. 1 inch, seal that, another inch, seal that. You're not going to be able to do a longer stretch because the angle is too harsh for that. Okay, so for this front point, you might find it easier to align the seam with a smaller bowl. So I've got this ever so slightly smaller bowl, which I'm going to use instead just for this end section. Okay, so on this end section, you'll see because of the sharp angle curving around this way and the fabric wanting to go this way as well, it's going to be more wrinkly than some of the other seams. So it's really important to just go over it and seal right up to the edge. It is a bit less neat than the other bits, but if you're worried about the airtight seal, we do glue this from the inside with the Aquashore to ensure it holds the air. It's just the nature of the shape of the Packraft, and having the point on the end, it's going to be a little bit wrinkly. So now we're left with just this short stretch to the end of the seam to the floor connection. We're going to leave that unsealed for now, and that means that you can still access the tube and you can apply the Aquashore to the inside of the seam. But what we will do to minimize the work once the glue has dried is we're going to seal up half of the strip. So we're going to seal it to one side of the tube so it stays stuck on there. So then we come back after the glue is dried, we're just going to stick it to the other tube. So now we're going to line it up and just attach this seam to one side. It's really important that you get it aligned perfectly at this point. So as you can see, all of this lines up, and I'm going to just run the strip along there. So we've got half of it on this and the other half is going to be left unsealed. And when we get to the end here, we'll be doing what we've done on all the other seams. We'll be folding it over so that the TPU is going to the tube, and the folded over bit, the TPU is going to seal to the floor. And then what we can do, once that's on, we can then maneuver the fabric and we can just put our iron in and iron it down there on the inside of the tube, and that's going to allow us to again seal this junction point that we have had with all the others with the Aquashore and ensure that's airtight. Okay, so what I've just done is I've sealed the strip to this tube. You can see, if I turn that over there, it's sealed halfway along. So I've left half of the seam to then go on this after the glue's dried. What's important though is when we get to the very end that we connect it up to this piece so that we can create that junction point on the floor in here of everything together, ready to seal with the Aquashore. So the way I'm going to do that, before I made sure everything was aligned, so that lines up like that, and then once you're happy that's butted up to the seam there but not sealed, you choose your point about 2 centimeters or so from the end, and you can just peel that up to ensure that it's lined up. So you can see they're lined up there. In the middle of the seam, they're butted up against each other, and we'll start sealing both of them together again. And we're just going to fold this tab over in there seal that down, and then we'll pop that open again and seal with the iron from the inside. So that's now held in place as I've sealed them together here, and I can enter the tube through this gap here. I'll then slide the bowl out the way, just down the tube there, and we can now just work on this junction point and prepare that accurately so that's ready to then be sealed with the Aquasure. So just maneuver it into the best position to work in. It's a bit tricky here because I'm trying to line it up for the camera. And you've got your tab here that you're folding back on itself, so you can work from this side as well. And just align that so it seals to the floor fabric on this side. And then when we go to the inside, we're left with these tabs here to seal down in front of it like we have on every other one, and to form a good airtight seal. So once you're happy with the positioning of it, you can take your iron and being really careful of these pieces as it is a tight area to work in, seal that down. Okay, so to make things more manageable, I'm going to seal this side down first, and once that's sealed and held in place, then I'll concentrate on this side afterwards. So I'm happy that's aligned and I'm not worrying what that's doing. And just be really cautious of what your iron is touching. We just want to tack it down, and once it's been tacked down in place, you can tack the other side down in place, and then once they're both tacked in place, then you can just stick the iron on top of both of them. Okay, so that's just held in place. Now I'm going to do the same for this side. Okay, so once you're happy you've tacked it in the correct place, you can then use the whole of the iron to seal it down, and that's a bit easier because you don't have to worry about touching these bits of the tubing when you're working with the tip of the iron. So you've got the whole of the iron in there, and you're just working along that whole seam in there, so you can push down flat with the iron. And as before, you can push up against the edge of the seam where it's folded over and get a nice good seal. So that's sealed down now, and as you can see, our junction point is completely sealed to the floor, and it's not the neatest because you're working in a difficult situation, but that can easily be accessed from this point to seal it with Aquasure and ensure that it's completely airtight. So that's the front seam done for this stage, and we're going to use this access point to apply the Aquasure to the point on the end, ensure that's airtight, the junction point, and you can seal the whole of the inside of the seam for added reassurance. Once the aquasure has dried, we'll then come back and we'll seal the other half of this seam to this, and there'll just be a small section that hasn't been seam sealed with aquasure. Okay, so I'm going to leave the sealing with the aquasure on the front of the boat until I've completed the seams on the rear of the boat. That way we can do all the sealing with the aquasure in one go and allow it to dry together overnight. So to seal the seams on the rear of the boat, it is exactly the same method as the other seams, except we split it into 2 strips of the seam fabric. We start just like we started at the front, going towards the floor and working around this way, coming all the way to the point at the rear of the boat, and we also connect the second seam at the junction point and work your way towards the point of the boat. And there's going to be a meeting of the 2 seams at the point of the boat. Okay, so we're going to start with the seam going out towards the floor of the boat, and that's going to curve all the way around here. It starts off exactly the same way as the front central seam and all the other seams. You want to fold over your tab, align it centrally in between these 2 pieces, and allow yourself 2 tabs at the bottom to fold down and seal in front of it to give a seal. You're going to be able to work on the first section of it on the flat, and at some point you're going to have to put the bowl in to drape the fabric over to get your 3-dimensional curve. The top should be nice and simple, and that should align nice and straight. You can probably work on the flat top section of your bowl. And that's all the same as the other processes until you get to the point at the rear of the boat. Okay, so in order to accommodate the curved point at the end of the boat, what I've done is, instead of putting the bowl inside the tube, I've actually folded it along this natural crease and doubled up the fabric and draped it over as if it was just one piece of fabric. And you'll see that allows you to line up these pieces when it's over the bowl. And then you continue just sealing a small section at a time. Okay, so as you can see, I've now sealed up to the point I've just mentioned, and from there on it is a completely straight line down to the bottom. Now we're going to do that with a separate piece of seam strip, and I've left just about 2 inches on the end of this one and cut that off so we can then glue that over the top of the other one once the other piece has been installed. Okay, so I've now flipped the boat over and I'm going to attach the final seam. This seam is completely straight and can be ironed on a flat surface. In order to align it, I'm going to take up the curvature and the point so I can butt these 2 pieces up to each other to get a nice join. I'm then going to seal approximately 1 inch of the end of this onto there, and the flap I've left from the previous step I will then glue on top of that. Similar to what we did on the front seam, I'm going to run this strip along just on one side only and heat seal it to one side only so that we can align it on our junction point on the inside accurately, and we'll glue that. That's going to then leave us able to access the inside of the tube where we can seal the junction point and the seam with aquasure. We'll then come back and seal the remaining half onto there, and you'll only be left with a small section that hasn't been sealed with aquasure. And it's completely straight seam, and it should have a good seal as it is. Okay, so I've now flipped over the boat and I'm aligning the seam into the junction point. As with all the other end of the seams, I've folded over a tab at the end of it, and I'm aligning that centrally in between the 2 tube pieces. And I'm allowing a tab in front of it to seal down. So once you're happy you have it aligned, you can seal that in and seal both pieces of the tube to that seam at this point, and that will leave the central bit of the seam open to access the tubing. Okay, so you can see I've now sealed both these bits into the junction point, and that means that we can now seal that with Aquasure to ensure there's not going to be any air leaking from that point. That's left us with approximately a 30 centimetre access point that we can now enter the tube and seal the seam with Aquasure from the inside, allow that to dry overnight, and come back and just seal up this access point. So I've now put some boxes back inside the tubes to prop up the fabric, and we're going to use the access hole to go inside the tubing and seal along the seam and the curve at the end and the junction point with Aquasure, just to have the reassurance that if there is any leakage, you've done what you can while the Packraft is still accessible on the inside. So I'm going to do that on the back of the boat, and then I'm going to go to the front and use the access point at the front to do exactly the same thing. Then I'm going to leave it overnight to dry. Okay, so I've now left the glue to dry overnight, and I'm now going to go inside the tubing and apply some baby powder on top of the Aquasure, just to ensure it doesn't stick to itself, because that's going to cause some damage. Okay, so I've now applied the baby powder inside, as you can see, just to make sure the Aquasure doesn't stick to itself. The final stages are to just seal up this section that we left unsealed on the rear section of the boat, and then you've got the small section and the front section of the boat. We'll seal them up, and then there's just a few bits where you're just going to glue down your overlap tab on those two seams at the rear, and there's a few other little sections where you'll apply some glue once the boat's inflated. Okay, so I've flipped the whole boat over, and for this straight section on the rear of the boat, I'm going to use this baking paper that I was using before. I've folded it over several times, so it's 4 layers thick, and that's just going to protect a little against the heat transfer through. And all you have to do is line your piece up so it butts up against the other piece, and you're going to seal that straight line, and that's going to seal the rear of the Packraft. The paper, the baking paper, will stay in there, and then you can either send it down the tube and use it at the front when you're sealing that section, or it can just live inside the Packraft forever, or at a later date you can push it out through the Boston valve hole. Okay, so I've now turned the boat round, and I'm going to do exactly the same on the stretch on the front central seam. I've collected the baking paper from the inside of the tube by reaching down all the way to the end of the boat, and now that's up this end, and I'm going to align this last section of seam and seal up the Packraft. It's extremely important you check there's nothing left in the tubes at this point. You haven't left any boxes from where you were letting the glue dry. You haven't let any bowls that you were using to get the three-dimensional curves. If you've left them in at this point, they're going to stay in there forever, so make sure they're not in there. Okay, so I've finished off the rear central seam and the front central seam, and the Packraft is completely sealed now. There's still a few bits that need to be glued, but we'll do that once it's inflated. I'm going to inflate it using an electric pump. If you're using an electric pump, never fully inflate it, as you could over-pressurize it and damage it. Inflate it to about 3/4 full and top it up by mouth. So as you can see, we're going to have to glue this last bit on, and there's a few pockets that will just seal up with the glue now as well. Okay, so now it's inflated, there's just a few things we're going to glue. We've got this tab that we left where we joined the two strips together. We're going to glue that down, and we'll leave that to set. And at the end of every seam, you're going to have a little pocket where you fold it over the seam to allow the TPU to connect with the TPU of the floor. So that's going to create a little slot which you can fill up with Aquashore, push down, and that will seal shut. So you've got those all around the boat, on the inside and the outside. So just get the brush that's included with the Aquashore, apply some glue to the brush, and put it in there and push it down. Once you've done that and let it dry, that'll be your Packraft completed. Okay, so once you've glued these final last pieces and the glue's dried, congratulations, you've just built yourself an ultra lightweight backpacking boat. Thanks for watching these Iron Raft self-build tutorials. For more information, visit the Iron Raft website at www.iron-raft.co.uk. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram.